Fakemon, Mesoamerica, Fakemon. That's this video. What's going on, guys? I'm Bully Absolute Brock, and this is the second installment of Pokemon Terrestrial Takeover. It's a Pokemon game concept with a region based on North and South America. And a big thing about the story of this game is the lore and stories that have been passed down through the generations. That being said, I thought it'd be cool if we made a lot of Pokemon based on Mesoamerica, a historic era that occurred 3,000 years before colonialization that had civilizations that stretched from the southern part of North America to Latin America. This includes civilizations like the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incas, and so on. And before we jump in, please like, subscribe, and watch the end for a surprise. And so this video gets pushed, thank you. And when speaking of Mesoamerica, something that will come up a lot is the Mesoamerican ball game. A game that I can best explain by being a mix between basketball and soccer. Without using their hands, players will try to hit a big rubber ball through a vertical ring to try and score points. And though you could play this game recreationally, it was heavily entwined with religion and rituals. So I wanted a Pokemon to represent this game, and I chose a regional cactus. It's a lot more active and competitive than its Hawaiian counterpart, using the rubbery fruit that grows on its body kinda like a ball. And said berry, and well, the cacturn for that matter, is based on the prickly pear cactus, with said pears being labeled as some kind of superfood. That's due to the pear's weird energy-enhancing properties. And there's a theory swirling around that Mesoamerican athletes would eat a cactus as a kind of steroid. And though that there's little information backing this theory, I would guess if it were real, it's the prickly pear cactus. Mainly due to its energy-enhancing properties like I mentioned earlier, and how it grew in the vicinity of a lot of these civilizations. And if it couldn't tell already, this cacturn's a grass and fighting type, also with abilities like Hustle and Anger Point to more lean into the athlete part of its design. Though I think the rubbery elbow and knee pads help enough with that. And while we're on the topic, let's do another regional form. This time, a bug and ground Trapinch and Vibrava. These two are based off of ambush bugs, and they're basically just bugs that lie in wait for their prey. Kinda like what Trapinch normally does, but normal Trapinch is based off an antlion, and that's not what this is. Antlions will dig into the ground to ambush their prey, but ambush bugs just hide and wait with camouflage to catch their prey. They both have lumps on their designs, reminiscent of the jagged ambush bug Nymph, and Vibrava specifically has that signature back crest that ambush bugs have that's kinda like a saw blade. However, here, it looks more like the wings of Hawaiian Vibrava. Speaking of which, Vibrava's design is much more reminiscent of dragonfly nymphs than Trapinch is. Specifically, it takes the color from the Mexican amberwing dragonfly, and it's also the color of wood, which will make more sense when we get on to regional Flygon. And to explain it, I gotta tell a story. In the land of the Maya, the moon goddess was said to be so beautiful that even the sun fawned after her. But the grandfather of the moon goddess didn't really like the fact that the sun had interest in his granddaughter. There's nothing for him to be worried about right now until the dry season came and the Mayan god of rain and storms Chalk got up to some mischief. Chalk went to chat with the grandfather, fabricating a story that the moon goddess was going to elope with the sun. The grandfather obviously didn't like this, and he gave Chalk the go-ahead to try and stop it any way he could. And Chalk, being the god of storms, made the biggest one he could. Chalk brought powerful rain and wind and a proverbial plethora of powerful lightning bolts by striking the clouds with his axe. Chalk struck every part of the earth that he could, including one that struck the moon goddess by mistake, making her body break into pieces and fall into the ocean. When Chalk finally calmed down and the storm ended, 400 dragonflies gathered her body parts and placed them in a canoe before carrying it back to her grandfather. The grandfather grieved for 13 days and nights while the dragonflies hummed. At the end of those days and nights, the dragonflies lifted away from the moon goddess, restoring her life force through all that time as she reascended into the sky. So in short, this dragonfly-inspired regional Flygon has an exoskeleton that's like a canoe, making it really buoyant in the water. The blue coloring though comes from the azure blue white, a damselfly which is like a cousin to dragonflies, and it's also like the blue ocean that the goddess fell into. On that note, its wings are kind of like her falling body parts, or shooting stars. And to go even deeper, the blades on its face and the tip of its tail are kind of like Chalk's axes, but also like the fronts and backs of a canoe. Hence the mentioning of wood with Vibrava. And this aerodynamic shape lets the Pokemon skim along the water really quickly or through the night skies. And on the topic of weather, the ocean, and flying, that brings us to Backpharah. And yeah, these guys are a little, irritated to say the least. The biggest inspiration for this is the jade mask of the Zapotec bat god. A mask that was made of 25 jade pieces and found in a tomb at the archaeological dig site of Mont Alban. The mask was probably found here since bats were seen as deities of death, and this was due to them being found in places like ruins and tombs. But more on that in a minute. The Zapotec civilization existed 2,500 years ago. They live in the valley of Oaxaca in southern Mexico and refer to themselves as some iteration of Bienana, which translates to cloud people. And all of that rolled together gives us a bat covered in jade and clouds. And the clouds act a lot like collar armor, which was used a lot by the Zapotec in warfare. But these are no ordinary clouds. They're acid rain clouds. There have been several reports in recent years of acid rain clouds pouring down to Mesoamerican ruins and degrading them significantly. And for those that don't know, acid rain is caused when a release of certain chemicals in the atmosphere react with water and oxygen and other chemicals to make sulfuric and nitric acid. Those chemicals mix with the rain and, well, you have acid rain. It's gotten a bit better in recent years, but it's still a problem. So I thought, why not make a Pokemon for this world that protects the ruins by raining this acid back down on the factories that produce them. After a recent industrial boom, these Pokemon learned really quickly how to control these rain clouds to protect their homes. After gathering all the pollutants, they'll come together in a massive cloud, which a group of bats in flight is called, that's a big coincidence, and they'll rain them back down to factories, machinery, and basically anyone they don't like. These guys are spiteful, and for good reason. They're just trying to protect their homes, like our next set of Pokemon. Here we have Durado and Armageddon. And yeah, they're simple little guys. They're armadillos with their shells based on the Mayan pyramids. But specifically, they take inspiration from the six-band armadillo, the giant armadillos, and the Glyptodon, which was basically a giant armadillo ancestor that roamed North and South America. And the shells they have translated pretty well into armor, specifically Mayan warrior armor. And there's even a Mayan legend that stated that the sun god sat two unruly deities on a bench and transformed that bench into armadillos and knocked them off to humble them. So to relate to that, these guys are like gentle giants. Duradillo can barely attack, or barely move for that matter, but when it evolves it gets the fighting type and it can fight, but it chooses to protect more than anything. That's where their names focus a lot more on defensive words, with Durado just being durable and armadillo, and Armageddon being armor, armadillo, Maya, and Glyptodon. But moving on to our next Fakemon, Chichi Cabra. It's an angry, dark-type dog Pokemon that's based on the southwestern United States interpretation of a Chupacabra. And I say southwestern United States because I didn't realize there were multiple interpretations of what a Chupacabra looked like. The first reports of a Chupacabra came from Puerto Rico, and those original sightings gave a much more reptilian, humanoid description, so whoops. But the one that depicts the Chupacabra as a mangy dog or coyote led to the inspiration being taken from dog breeds that originated in Mexico. The two big ones it takes inspiration from are the Colfos, or the Mexican wolf dog, and the Mexican hairless dog, which has a name that I cannot pronounce. Like I already said, this iteration of the Chupacabra is said to be kinda hairless and mangy, taken from the hairless dog, but the black color is taken from the Colfos. And to go even further with the dog theme, we can look at one of the largest Mesoamerican cities, Cantona. Cantona was thought to be inhabited by the Olmec civilization, who did a lot of ritual bloodletting. That in turn relates to the Chupacabra's main characteristic of sucking livestock dry of blood. And the red patches of fur on Chichi Cabra also relate to that. But back to Cantona, it was thought to be invaded by a group called the Chichi Mecha. They're thought to be strong hunters and warriors who were nomadic, and they also practiced animal sacrifices, hence the red throat on Chichi Cabra. And yes, that is a bit dark for a Pokemon game, but I don't care. And the Nahuatl word for dog, being Chichi, is found in their name. And combine that with Chupacabra is how I got Chichi Cabra's namesake. And since we got onto Chichi Cabra by talking about the Olmec civilization, let's keep going with another Olmec Pokemon. This next one is based off the Olmec giant heads, a group of massive stone heads carved by the Olmec civilization, thought to depict their leaders. And a Pokemon that's already based on giant stone heads is Nosepass, so I gave it a regional evolution. That being Sunos, a rock and fire type. And just like the Olmec giant heads, this guy is massive. And it combines several aspects, being a sundial, a compass, something to do with astronomy, and, gladiatorial sacrifices. All of which come from past and present theories of what the AZTEC Sunstone was used for. The AZTEC Sunstone is a large stone disc that was rediscovered under what is now Mexico City, and is commonly now thought to be a calendar of sorts. But at one point it was thought to be a sundial, which Sunos clearly looks like. At another point they thought it had something to do with astronomy, and the main center body of Sunos is like a glowing sun. And lastly, it was thought to have something to do with gladiatorial sacrifices, which gave the rise to its new signature ability, Ring of Fire. It has the effects of no guard and arena trap, except Sunos is also stuck in the battle. This all happens when something steps on the outer disc of Sunos. And since it only has one speed, and when I say one speed, I don't mean there are multiple speeds and it only has one of those, I mean that it has one base speed, it can't really run away, so it traps its opponent there to fight. To the death. Or till fainting. This is Pokemon after all. And this idea gave rise to its signature move, Sun-Touched Hammer. A fire-type hammer move that's super powerful but does have a cooldown, and comes from it swinging the giant protrusion on its head down onto whatever's in front of it. And though the one speed's a little gimmicky, it gives major props to every other stat. And if you want to see more about abilities, stats, or just some Fakemon early, go follow me on Instagram. Shameless plug aside, and the fact that I really don't think I need to explain Sunos' name, let's move on to my favorite family in this video. These are the Steel and Psychic Automaton Pokemon, Ultami, Revolm, and Gigolmek. These also took inspiration from the Olmec heads, with the first two being almost entirely head, but I didn't think they represented the Olmec heads enough, so that's where Sunos came from. These guys lean a lot to the trope of golems guarding ancient ruins and cities, basically acting as their protectors. Heck, even Gigolmek has golem in its name, along with Giga, Automaton, Olmec, and Mecha, Revolm being a lot simpler with just being Revolution and Olmec, and Ultami being Olmec, Automaton, and Mini. but also having a really crazy coincidence. There's a group of indigenous people in Mexico called the Otomi, and I have no idea how I got that close by just combining a bunch of words together. I swear it's a coincidence, and I don't doubt you for not believing me, but I swear this was not on purpose. Anyway, moving on from that, there's a god in the Olmec culture called the Banded Eye God. There's not much known about it, but it does have a band running through its 2 eyes and a notch on its head, with said notch reminding me of screws, leading to this whole idea of an automaton golem. But once more, the single eye that all these Pokemon have come from a Japanese yokai called a Sukamogami. A Sukamogami is essentially an inanimate object that gains a soul after 100 years of use, which works really well with this whole idea of an automaton. And since these guys were made in recent times, their rediscovery is rather recent. They're still pretty rare, but a lot of them were reawakened after a disturbance at an archaeological site. So that being said, this is like one of those Pokemon that there's not a lot known about it, but it still looks really cool. But anyway, I think it's time to move on to our last 2 Fakemon of the video, being Ocelot and Katsuguar. And yes, these are the Lucario Zoroarks of the region, otherwise known as Furbait. Let's start with the pre-evolved form Ocelot, with its biggest inspiration being the Teotihuacan Ocelot. This was an ocelot-shaped offering vessel found between the pyramids of the Sun and Moon in the Mesoamerican city of Teotihuacan. God, I know I butchered that name. But that aside, these guys have several patterns that look like the Sun and the Moon. For example, the beasts that float around Ocelot are kind of like the Sun, and it uses those to train its psychic powers, which at the moment are kind of weak. This leads it to fight more hand-to-hand, hence the dual fighting type as well. It also has several stripes on it that look like crescent moons. And yeah, if you couldn't tell before, its name is just Obsidian and Ocelot. But then there's Katsuguar, who gains a bit more control over its psychic abilities, but now it's just a little more tricky. So it's dropped the fighting type for a dark type. It'll still use physical combat from time to time, but it will just lurk in the shadows whenever it's hunting its prey. Katsuguar also focuses a lot more on a being known as Tezcatlipoca. He's a deity in the AZTEC pantheon, and he's represented with an obsidian mirror in his chest, which is like 1-for-1 in the Pokemon. And a notable thing about him is that he's always associated with a jaguar and has one leg that's completely made of obsidian. And though neither of these Pokemon have an obsidian leg, the context for why they use obsidian is a lot clearer now. And another thing is that the word for jaguar in Nahuatl is Ocelotl, and Ocelot just means field jaguar. Hence why we have an Ocelot evolving into a jaguar, but this is Pokemon. We have like a dozen fish that evolve into completely different animals, and it aggravates me so much. At least this makes a little bit of sense. I'm getting off track, aren't I? Anyway, Tezcatlipoca was also the god of several things, including the night sky, another leading into the pyramid of the moon, time, why both Pokemon have a piece of obsidian on their wrist that looks like watches, the Great Bear constellation, hence why there are several patterns on its wrist that look like bear paws. There's also a slight note that the black color comes from the black bear, but it also comes from the black jaguar, and that connection's a little But all in all, the obsidian on this Pokemon resembles the jaguar spots. They also have ties to celestial bodies, for example, the ones on its hips looking like a cartoony sun, its tail kind of looking like a shooting star, and the big hunkin' piece of obsidian around its back looking like a crescent moon. It's also like a Hagoromo scarf, which is a floating scarf that's depicted with a lot of Japanese deities, and it's commonly shown in media. And then there's Katsuguar's name, coming from cats, Tezcatlipoca, and jaguar. And after that, I'm out of Fakemon. But I did promise a surprise at the start of this video, right? Hello? Hickory Labs.
Never took you to be the professional type, Alden.
Samson? Samson Aster? How have you been, Mr. Rocket Man? It's been ages since we've talked. It seems like Falcosmo's in a good mood, at least.
Indeed he is. There's never a dull moment around the gym or lab these days.
The only dull moment's you, old pal.
What?
Never mind. So why did you call? You doing something like this is just about as rare as your partner.
Oh, quiet down. Anyway, it appears we found something that I think you'll appreciate in regards to your research. Remember that old impact site?